Cool. Sorry. Are
Nice.
you genuinely going to do the podcast with those things on?
Yeah. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And Neil Almond.
Hello.
And the focus of this episode will be 5 things every teacher needs to know about reading comprehension. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
This week, amongst other bits and pieces I've been reading, I went back to arguably my favourite paper on the subject of reading, which is called The Role of Background Knowledge in Reading Comprehension, a critical review by Reed Smith, is the main author, Pamela Snow, and others are involved. It is a joy to read. I mean, so much when you're dealing with reading research and educational research generally, it's not always that well written. Often it's a difficult thing to take a complex subject and make it digestible, but they absolutely achieved that with this paper, alongside connecting together lots of different bits and pieces relating to not just reading comprehension, but they connect reading comprehension to ideas relating to cognitive load theory. I think it's a really thoughtful and nuanced paper, brilliant to read, one to go back to time and again for anyone who is interested in the role of background knowledge in reading. And increasingly, it is an area of interest when it comes to reading development, and rightly so. And this is a wonderful place to start. What about you, Neil? What are you reading for?
Recently, I've kind of been going down the science literature route and looking at what stuff there's out there in terms of the science, if you want for a better word, on teaching science. And I came across students' ideas about plants and plant growth, and effectively quite a small little study where a researcher asked 200 kids between kindergarten and I think grade 8, so our kind of like year 1 through to year 9, just what they understood about plants and their kind of conceptual understanding of what a plant is. And I think kind of my main kind of like takeaway from it is just how important it is when you're teaching, something as broad as plants, is that, you're just providing as many different prototypes of what a plant is, whether that's, flowering, non-flowering, even the idea of, in the paper, they specifically mentioned that particularly for quite young children, they kind of didn't necessarily get the connection that a tree is a plant. And just so when you're kind of first introducing this concept, just how important it is to kind of throw every sort of prototype or every kind of prototype on the continuum of what a plant is, even throwing a few things that may look like a plant because they share a similar characteristic, like perhaps like a mushroom. They'll see the stalk of a mushroom and just assume that, I know a mushroom is something that grows in the ground, and this little thing here must be a stem, so therefore I'm going to assume that it's a plant. So just kind of really kind of reiterated that idea of showing that the broadness of that category when first introducing concepts that kind of are kind of quite wide ranging in what they can be. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
Really interesting paper about fractions and the teaching of fractions. It's called Representations in Teaching and Learning Fractions, and it's by Ted Watanabe. It's from 2002, and it has some really interesting points for discussion about what we mean when we say model, what we mean when we say representation, and how the two can be interchanged, perhaps not for the right reasons. And so it really goes in depth about the decisions we make when we're representing sort of proportional relationships. And so I'd recommend checking that out. And it's one of the few NCTM, the American body, one of the few papers that's not behind a paywall. Because that's one of the things that disappoints me so much about that body is that lots of their really interestingly titled papers are not free to access, and that doesn't seem like the point of math education to me. So, but we'll save that around for another time. So we've discussed reading comprehension on the podcast before, but it's been, I reckon, somewhere close to 2 years since the last time we just sat down and looked at reading comprehension and how we might approach it in the classroom. And I thought, of all the things that there are to know about reading comprehension and all the things we discussed, what might the 5 most important things be for teachers to know? So I don't know if we'll probably take a more discussion-based approach to this episode. We'll throw as many different ideas into the ring, and then we'll sort of try and decide on those top 5. And it might help people, I don't know, focus their CPD priorities for 2023-24. If they're thinking, okay, if my teachers know these 5 things, we'll be in a really good place to start. So I don't know, Chris, if I could throw it your way, what do you reckon one thing could be that people need to know?
So I think a really good place to start are the enabling conditions that allow for comprehension in the first place. So before we get into the details of how we might think about comprehension, the interconnected bodies of knowledge that underpin it, it's worth thinking about what else needs to be in place in order for comprehension to stand a chance. And if we think to basically every model or every framework there is for describing reading, one thing that is included in there is the idea that in order for reading comprehension to take place, pupils need to have a level of expertise in recognizing words, and in particular, they need to be relatively fluent in their reading. What we mean by that is if the words aren't flowing, to some extent at least, then too much of a pupil's cognitive resources then have to be devoted to that process of word recognition, and there's too little of those, or too few of those cognitive resources that are left to be devoted to the challenging act of comprehending text. So I'd say, like, perhaps one of the most important things to know about comprehension is that it is underpinned by reading fluency, this flow of words as we read. Now, it's tempting to look at it in just those terms, but I think it's also worth noting that there is, of course, a reciprocal relationship between fluency and comprehension, because, as I've said, fluency supports comprehension, but equally, the more that we comprehend, the more the reading itself can flow. So there is this reciprocal relationship, this virtuous cycle between the two.
Absolutely agree with everything that Chris has said there, unsurprisingly for this particular topic. Again, just worth bearing in mind, I think, this idea that it's perhaps a lethal mutation. I'm not sure, maybe not, maybe that's unfair, but it's quite easy to kind of get some sort of magic number into your head, as opposed to what the reading fluency, words correct per minute, if that's that's the common metric that many people use. That passing that kind of abstract number means kind of like job done, and like I can lay off the reading fluency practice now, which really isn't the case, evidently. And we'll go into this a little bit more detail once the kind of text structures and get more complex. It's likely that fluency will drop a little bit because they're just not used to that structure of the text. Likewise as well, the type of genre that you're reading could impact it. I know, for example, thinking back to one of my own experiences as a reader back in secondary school, whenever we were in drama and reading Shakespeare, he starts every line with a capital letter, whether it's the end of a sentence or not. And so that kind of really stunts your fluency of reading that passage, because at that point, you've seen a capital letter so long, and just assume that, right, I'm going to take a stop. Because obviously a new sentence is starting, and obviously that massively changes the way that you might pronounce a particular phrase, sentence, paragraph, whatever it might be. And so it's kind of really important to, I think, keep in the back of our minds when it comes to reading fluency, this idea that, it's a continuum. It's not a kind of, you get through the door with it and then it's like jobs are good. And it's something you kind of always have to be, thinking and considering. And I'm sure, those teachers who have taught year 6 and have taken year 6 through various, different SATs papers, they've experienced that firsthand where, some of their fluent readers perhaps, haven't quite got through as much of the paper that they thought they would. And one of the reasons might be because, I'm thinking particularly back to, I can't remember what year it was, but the music box, that was quite a thick, dense text where if you're reading fluency, really wasn't up to par, that would have impacted you massively. So I think that would be the only thing that I'd add on to Chris's idea. Then it can't exist without comprehension, can't exist without it. But equally, it's important to kind of remember in the back of our heads that it's not a simple, yes, they're fluent enough, no, they're not. There's a kind of a whole wider continuum behind reading fluency that's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, and it's also, as you've alluded to there, text specific. To the point where, for example, there is this temptation to think, okay, these kids aren't fluent yet, and so comprehension isn't going to happen to the level I'd want it to, so let's not worry so much about comprehension, which firstly would be, it's a very silly way to think about things, because you can always be developing the bodies of knowledge upon which comprehension is based. But equally, you can recognize that with the text that a pupil has in front of them, that okay, so maybe they're not fluent with the first time through of reading it, but they don't have to just read it once. That might be what we do for assessment, but that doesn't have to be what we do in a given reading lesson. We can take a chunk of text and say, you know what, we are going to read it repeatedly. We're going to develop fluency. I'm going to, for this text, I'm going to, model it to you. And as well as that developing fluency more generally, it seems to research suggests there's this kind of transfer effect here. It also allows pupils to comprehend the text that's in front of them in a way that they would be able to do were they more fluent the first time they read it. So as well as there being this continuum of fluency, it's also the case that it's kind of specific to the text that's in front of the pupil, not just in terms of how difficult it is, but also their own familiarity with the words, the sentence structure, the way it's put together. So we can take advantage of this more flexible understanding of fluency to support comprehension in the lessons that we teach. But yeah, that's at heart, key thing. Comprehension is underpinned by a certain level of reading fluency. So if you've got kids in your class who are struggling with comprehension, don't just assume that it is because they don't understand the vocabulary of the text or the sentence structure. It really might just be that the words aren't flowing in a great enough extent in terms of the pace, in terms of the prosody, etc., that will allow them to comprehend it.
Yeah, I think it's worth just being really clear when we say fluency, we're talking about the kind of 3 strands. We're talking about automaticity, prosody, and accuracy. So obviously, you could be really fluent and have good prosody, but if your accuracy, that might be a particular strand within it that, really is going to let you down. And I think I kind of saw it mentioned in a couple of articles, how, actually the accuracy that, potentially can make a lot of that difference between that comprehension being there, being able to occur and not. So definitely worth keeping in mind about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're not decoding the words correctly, what chance do you have, in the end? And it's tempting to skip ahead. It's tempting to look at parts of reading fluency and say, well, you know what? Let's see if we can focus on pace or focus on prosody. If you're not recognizing the words on the page accurately, then it's something wrong that's flowing, and so the chances of it actually making sense to you are fairly limited.
Nice. I mean, that all makes sense. Fairly uncontroversial. What have you got for us, Neil? What would the first thing you'd say that all teachers need to know about comprehension?
So really kind of coming off the back of my talk that I've kind of used this kind of academic year at Research Ed, it's just this idea of the lack of transferability of comprehension kind of between texts, and that, you know, understanding text A isn't necessarily a good proxy for understanding, you know, text B, because the only real kind of transferable skills related to comprehension are those things that are biologically primary. So obviously getting kids to answer you know, question types. You know, Shanahan in one of his blogs mentions how, you know, there's no research evidence at all to suggest that these are even a thing. And then he talks about how these comprehension, you know, these kind of skills that then kind of get you know, wrapped up in these kind of question types, you know, they lack any kind of psychological reality, which, you know, is quite a damning phrase for me, I think. And I think, you know, that kind of makes sense when we kind of understand, you know, what the brain does when it tries to, you know, comprehend something, and kind of, you know, the creation of these situational models. I think that kind of makes, it kind of gives great clarity as to why, not necessarily just kind of different question types, but why I think any type of preordained, designed comprehension task by a third party is likely to fail, because they've kind of assumed what the key points are, that the situational model that the children in front of you, of which there'll be 30 different ones, because a large part of how we comprehend is kind of overlaying these kind of real basic propositions of the text with our own you know, background knowledge. You know, this third party is assuming that these questions are going to allow these pupils to create that accurate representation of that text, which just isn't true, because what they are doing effectively is just, well, you know, here are the reading domains from the Key Stage 2 SATs. We're just going to kind of make sure we've asked a few questions that kind of relate vaguely to these things. Usually what happens is there'll be like, you know, one summarizing question. There'll be one prediction question, because, you know, they're only worth about 5 to 7% of the marks on the final paper. But we're going to ask lots of inference style questions, lots of, you know, retrieval questions, as in, you know, retrieve information from the text type questions, because, you know, they can be worth as much to 50% of the mark. You know, I've had my kind of, you know, the wool's kind of been lifted from my eyes, and, you know, I was fully on board with that kind of teaching. And it's only kind of been the last kind of 2 or 3 years, by understanding what, you know, understanding this one model of comprehension, is either this, you know, construction integration model, that it's really made clear to me why any kind of preset question is doomed to fail, because there's that assumption that that question will be able to pinpoint why the situation model of those children perhaps, you know, isn't accurate enough to generate the meaning that's, you know, the author of the text desired. And that's why I think when it comes to kind of comprehension, what like third party companies can do is kind of almost, I think, just, you know, like study guides, almost kind of think, you know, here's like the tier 2, the tier 3 vocabulary that's going to be really useful, and here's some, you know, discussion questions that you may want to point out perhaps. But I really do think anything more than that probably isn't that useful, I think, in kind of developing the comprehension for those, you know, 30 plus kids that are, you know, in front of you. You need to know them as a class, and you need to have that idea of, right, knowing this class, where do I think this construction integration model may falter? Do I need to tell them something? Do I need to, you know, probe something a little bit more? Or, you know, are they able to, you know, comprehend this if I explain what this word means, etc.
In some ways, this ties in with one of the more fashionable debates of the last 5 years that I've been on Edu Twitter, which is this idea of generic transferable skills versus, you know, interconnected bodies of knowledge, and which one kind of makes sense. And often people talk about, well, actually skills are just, you know, if you zoom out far enough from knowledge, that's what you get, etc., etc. But it's worth kind of pinpointing what this means with regards to reading. If we're saying that like inference isn't this generic transferable skill, then what is it? Well, depends what we mean by skill. Skill can mean anything. It can mean a body. It can itself mean a body of knowledge. It often does in research. It can just mean a capability. What we really mean when we say something like inference isn't a like generic transferable skill. What we're really saying is this isn't a thing that we can teach that then will apply necessarily to another text with a different set of words within that text. The challenge with that is, of course, that inference, while not being a transferable skill from one text to another, there is a general capability that people have to infer that goes beyond reading into the kind of inferences that we make when we're having a conversation. If I say, you know what, I'm feeling pretty thirsty, I'm going to go to the bar, you're likely to infer that I'm going to get a drink. It's not obvious, I've not stated it, but you're likely to make that inference. And it's those kind of inferences that we're making when we read text. And this is essentially something that's seemingly biologically primary and specific to the thing that we're talking about. There is always a bit of detective work involved with comprehending discourse between two people. It's something that we're always doing, but it doesn't seem to be the case, or there's no real necessary basis for us to think, oh, put aside the thing that we're talking about, there is this capability that we can teach that somehow disconnects from that content. It is completely embedded within that content. And I think that aligns with a sensible perspective of what knowledge is, in effect. The same is true, of course, for summarizing, retrieving, and all of these things. If you don't think that, it's tempting to think that summarizing is this skill because we can get better at it, but all you have to do is to find out from someone, ask them to find the main idea or to summarize something they know loads about, and then ask them to summarize something that they're a bit less familiar with, and they will struggle. Ask me to watch a baseball match and then summarize what's gone on, I wouldn't stand a chance. Ask me to summarize a football match, I'd like to think I'd do a fairly decent job. Those two domains aren't particularly far removed. They're both competitive ball sports played over the space of a couple of hours, and yet in one I would be hopeless at summarizing, and the other I'd like to think I'd do a pretty good job. And again, it's because I know about one of those things and I know next to nothing about the other. And the same is true with summarizing a text. The same is true when it comes to retrieving from a text. The same is true for lots of these other things that are the kind of like the content domains of the SATs. So yeah, couldn't agree more. I imagine this is a sentence we're going to say over and over in this, podcast, Neil. We are quite closely in alignment in our thoughts on reading comprehension. But yeah, couldn't agree more with this idea about transferable skills not really being something we should target in our teaching, which I guess brings us on to what perhaps we might do instead, or what kind of bodies of knowledge we might be seeking to build instead.
How contested is the biologically primary aspect of all this?
Honestly, it's not usually discussed in these terms, to my experience, from my kind of reading of papers. The way that it is discussed is if you read books on spoken language development of, say, 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, the really interesting years of spoken language development where stuff is changing like exponentially, you will find discussions of this stuff. You'll find discussions of how particular environments allow for this stuff to develop. Now, it's rare when you read this stuff that you see people explicitly talking about biologically primary, but it's absolutely the case that they're talking about the reading between the lines that young children do and how this develops naturally from experience as a component of their language development. And yeah, connecting that to the idea of biologically primary learning rather than biologically secondary just kind of makes sense to me. So it might be contested, but only so far, I think, as the underlying ideas of biologically primary and biologically secondary are in the first place.
Yeah, so like you said, Chris, you've both sort of been thinking along the same lines. Is there anything you think that you would put in this group that you might think Neil might not be as convinced about?
Oof, that's a tough one. Perhaps the value or lack thereof of disciplinary reading for younger kids, maybe. I'm not convinced that it is that easy to target or that easy to introduce for a primary level. I think there are certain things we can do, but I guess it depends how we define disciplinary literacy. Because if you're talking about disciplinary literacy as the kind of reading and writing that a scientist will do or a historian will do, then yeah, I think there are bits and pieces we can do relating to that. If we're being a bit more, if we're looking at the other aspect of disciplinary literacy, which is the idea of helping pupils to understand the disciplinary knowledge of a given subject through an understanding of how literacy is used in that subject, I think that's, even if it can be achieved at a primary level, I'm not sure that I think there are much bigger fish to fry, to the point where I'd need to be in a school for like a decade before that became my main focus as a literacy lead. But happy for people to suggest I'm wrong. This is not something that I'm certain about.
Would definitely, I think, include aspects of disciplinary literacy, but they would very much fall within the former example that you gave. Just, I'm talking about some real, quite simplistic ideas in that, if you've just done a science experiment, you're going to write up, maybe just 2 parts of it. You're going to talk about how, I know it's not just scientists, but you would talk about how scientists in particular, they love a subheading. Subheadings are really important for scientists because it helps make everything that little bit clearer. It kind of gives them that idea, what's coming up, what you're about to read is related back to this idea of, the method or the conclusion or the hypothesis, whatever it might be. And, there's quite a lot of research a fair bit of research out there to suggest that, kids sometimes they skip over these things because they don't think that's, particularly important. Now, you absolutely could argue that this idea of subheading, isn't necessarily, and it doesn't just belong within the scientific discipline. That's a kind of a wider, literacy idea. But I think it's one of those things that you want to talk about, as when we're writing as scientists, this is something that, we want to really make sure that we include, because, scientists do use these things quite a lot. And I think as more people seem to be going towards, some sort of like extended writing as part of some sort of outcome within the wider curriculum. I just think providing those, some examples of what this disciplinary writing might look like through reading a disciplinary text, is probably a useful idea to do. But I'd only be looking at this, as you say, comfortably, latter end of year 5, year 6-ish time for, to go through like the big ideas. But clearly, secondary colleagues as well. I know this is thinking deeply about primary education. We're in the fortunate position where we do absolutely, and, quite rightly, extend our audience to secondary colleagues. And so I think, for them as well, this idea that, there are within the disciplines of the teachers, I think because this idea of like whole school literacy at secondary schools was like tarnished quite a lot. And I think if you mention whole school literacy to teachers of a certain age who went through a certain point, it kind of fills them with horror a little bit. But it's that understanding that no, within that discipline, within your discipline that you teach, there is some worthwhile, literacy knowledge within your discipline that is, worth teaching and worth, investigating, and how that can support, the pupils in front of you.
I think like a way to summarize like what I think about disciplinary literacy at a primary level, that probably kind of, I hope, does a better job of what I did a moment ago, is to say, if a literacy lead came to me and said, what do I need to know about disciplinary literacy? My answer would probably be, you don't. Not because disciplinary literacy isn't important, but because the aspects of disciplinary literacy that I care about are things that are already almost certainly going on in the school, just because the rest of the curriculum is adequate. So if they're looking at sources in history and discussing them and talking about their validity, maybe the teacher in there doesn't know that they're doing disciplinary literacy, but they are. And equally, as Neil says, if someone's talking about an accurate description of the methods you used so that someone could potentially replicate your experiment and see if they got the same results in science, well, you're doing disciplinary literacy. It does, and I think that the most important stuff related to disciplinary literacy at primary level just kind of happens anyway if the rest of the curriculum is good. So I'm not fussed if a primary literacy lead or primary teacher or senior leader doesn't know what disciplinary literacy is, if that makes sense, assuming the rest that they're on the ball with the rest of the curriculum.
It feels like it's going to be quite difficult to separate you guys in anything.
I don't know. I kind of always felt the idea of comprehension strategies sort of divided us a little. I'm probably more pro strategy than you are, Chris, perhaps. I don't want to put words in your mouth, obviously, but I think, for me, there seems to be enough evidence that suggests that, teaching these things are a good thing, and that, they aren't just something that should be left to, like an interventionist group, who's, if you're thinking about the simple view of reading and, thinking about, where word recognition, decoding is all fine and dandy, but for some reason they're still not comprehending. Those used to be the kinds of pupils that you would then kind of give reading strategy interventions for. But I just think, I think there's a fair bit of evidence that suggests that you can do these things whole class, and that I kind of think, like phonics, it benefits everyone and certainly isn't necessarily going to harm anyone by teaching them, a few of these strategies. And I certainly don't mean, and I'm sure that I don't mean that, somehow you do these for weeks and weeks on end and the strategy becomes the goal of the reading instruction. That's definitely not the point. Strategies the term strategy means that you deploy it strategically. So it's just like a tool in the toolbox for children to use when they realize, this construction integration, the situational model that I'm trying to form in my head, something's gone wrong there, so I need to go back and fix that, which I'm 9 times out of 10 it's probably just reread it again, perhaps a little bit slowly, a little bit slower, to make sure that you've actually read it accurately. But I think there are other strategies that are worthwhile in teaching. Obviously, that the first strategy I kind of think it always makes sense to go with is actually just teaching children explicitly the idea that when you read something, it's meant to make sense, and if it doesn't, something's gone wrong somewhere, so you need to do something to try and fix it. The research literature calls that one a comprehension monitoring, and it's quite a simple one to the idea of being meta about your own comprehension and realizing that something doesn't quite seem right here, is quite an important one to begin with. But before we go into the different ones I'll teach, I'll give Chris a time to rebuttal my claims. Perhaps he'll tell me that he's seen the light and agrees with me, or...
I don't think, my opinion on comprehension strategies hasn't changed much since I wrote about them in my book a couple of years ago. I absolutely think they're valuable. I think that they can and should be taught. Where I perhaps disagree is, the nature of the research on this stuff is that you want to teach them quick. You want to teach them in one go. And so we've got lots and lots of these bits of research that says, look, we're going to teach this stuff in a block of 3 or 4 weeks. And we're going to, quite an intense focus, and then we're going to see if it has a result. And generally it does. And the temptation from that is to then go, well, you know what? That's how we need to teach them in the classroom. We need to teach them in kind of intense blocks of, I explicitly modeled them, and then there's this gradual release of responsibility. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, the nature of the research into this, because this is the way that the research is conducted, that's all we've got. We don't really have a great deal of research where people have said, you know what, I'm going to look at summarizing, visualizing, self-questioning, kind of those comprehension strategies that seem to have the greatest effect. And we're going to embed them into our comprehension instruction over the space of a couple of years, and then see whether that's helped compared to an equivalent class that hasn't included these comprehension strategies. And yet I suspect that that's probably the most sensible way to teach these. Beyond an intervention, I think if you're going to get pupils to, in effect, think a little bit more carefully, to take a more active role, to recognize their own responsibility when it comes to comprehension, that why would you not do that piece by piece over a longer period of time, rather than match it up kind of like perfectly with the way that the research initially teaches this stuff. I don't think I've studied the research into comprehension strategies as carefully as you have, Neil, but I'm not as convinced that there is really great evidence for the teaching of them on a whole class level. I think most of this tends to be inferences that are made based on smaller groups. And generally, where you take this smaller group stuff and try and scale it up, it doesn't seem to have a particularly if you do this with a large enough sample, it doesn't seem to then have the impact that people are after. A good example of this being, what's it called? Reciprocal reading. So reciprocal reading, the EEF have done a big old trial on that, and it seems to have just about had an effect when done with a small group, and that effect's disappeared when you're looking at whole classes. And this is big sample. I think it tells us something about what comprehension strategies teaching possibly does. So yeah, where I would agree with you is I think the sensible thing to do is to teach them. I think the sensible thing to do is to embed them into instruction. I don't think in practice there's any disagreement there. I think where there might be a bit of disagreement is that I've got this sneaking gut suspicion that if you took all of these interventions and all of this research that said, look, teaching this comprehension strategy works, and the control group, instead of having relatively poor reading instruction or nothing, which is usually the case, if instead they just had instruction where they were encouraged to read, discuss, and deeply think about a text, I don't think we'd see a great deal of difference. Until the research is done that shows that, the sensible thing is to teach comprehension strategies. But I've got this gut suspicion that it's the active engagement with text that is the kind of the active ingredient in here, like the mechanism behind it, rather than like a particular protocol for doing summarizing and then doing, self-questioning, or all the bits and pieces that are involved in things like reciprocal reading.
Maybe Sam Sims is listening to this episode and thinks, yeah, that's worth a look at.
Yeah, I mean, or the EEF. The EEF are about to do a great big study on this thing, and all they need to do is have a control group that isn't just business as usual. They just need to have a control group in which the people who aren't getting this thing are still getting small, like when they do this with small groups, when they do reciprocal reading with small groups, they need the control small group to have active discussion of text, which makes sure that children are being nudged towards doing the detective work that we want them to do in order to comprehend the text, to recognize their responsibility when it comes to engaging with a text, without the particular reciprocal reading protocol, the comprehension strategies, for example. But I don't see that happening, sadly.
Which is a shame, because I'd love to know. I can totally see how, obviously, a lot of what these reading strategies that I kind of talk about, that's what they're there for, to do. Effectively, what they're there to do, they're just there to make you think deeply about the text.
The fact that almost none of these don't work, that's the thing for me. When you look at an intervention, they go, oh, we're doing this comprehension strategy, and we'll do this and it works, and we do this and it works, and we do this almost completely different thing, and look that it works. You start to look at it and go, well, okay, what's the common denominator here?
Yeah, no,
is it this particular protocol? Is it this particular, we've used a graphic organizer to get them to infer? Or is it this? Or is it an adult sitting down with a group of kids, giving them some time and making sure they actively pay attention to text? Again, there are enough really surprising findings in reading research for me not to fall off my chair if it turns out that, yes, a particular protocol or a particular comprehension strategy is what we need, and it's that is like the secret sauce here. It isn't just getting kids to actively engage with text. I may well be wrong. It wouldn't really surprise me at all. But right now, I know what my gut says.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly lots of the studies that I kind of look at in my talk, I don't come out too favorably in terms of reciprocal teaching or reciprocal reading, purely because I don't think the studies with those are done particularly well. Rosenshine and say Meister did some really, really good. Rosenshine, before he was famous, that's how I always open up that slide. Before he was known for his 10, but actually, 17 principles of instruction. They go through a lot of, they just reviewed all the literature on what he called reciprocal teaching, then, which is reciprocal reading is effectively a offshoot of that. They're used pretty interchangeably within the literature, and he says, we don't know which of these strategies works, which ones why doesn't. And then you look at kind of the fact that there were some kids there who were like good decoders but poor comprehenders, and they had like 50 sessions of this, and it made no difference to their overall stuff at all. It's that stuff, that reciprocal teaching stuff, that seems a little bit suspect to me, but there've been a few more recent papers that seem to have me a little bit more hopeful, that these things are worth teaching. And I think actually if we kind of discuss, how I think these should be done in practice, probably wouldn't be too dissimilar to the way that Chris has said. I don't want to be teaching these for blocks and blocks on end. I think we needed to do a little bit of that initially because we're dealing with children in like year 3, and this idea of just let's just ask some who, what, when, why, where questions as we're reading this text. That will take a while to embed. But certainly should just be the case. And I think importantly, if a kid doesn't need to do that to understand, then for heaven's sake, don't make them do that, because that's when they learn to hate reading. It's when they are forced to use these strategies in some sort of weird, convoluted way to prove their understanding of the text beyond just you being able to tell through discussion that they're comprehending it absolutely a-okay. But I agree with Chris. I would love to see some research on this. I think the EEF does many good things, but I think not having a decent control group here really is missing an opportunity.
Like the Rosenshine and Meister paper that you mentioned, the meta-analysis effectively says, first, if you look at comprehension outcomes that aren't from a researcher designed test, but are actually just general kind of standardized comprehension outcomes, the effect size comes right down. Still significant, but then it's only significant still when you are comparing it to control groups where the pupils either were business as usual, which is in classroom reading independently with no help, or where they're given what is obviously poor reading instruction. So the kids are shown read a short chunk of text, the teacher models how to find a main idea, and then the kid is asked to do the same thing. So it's that kind of classic read a little bit of text and then do something that takes you ages, which isn't an equivalent. The reason I think this stuff works is that you're getting kids to actively engage with loads of text. So as a control group, it's a pretty poor show. But there's definitely room for some really interesting research to take place there still. And like as a final thing to note, there's still, what I'm talking about here is my own sense of doubt about this body of research. But the sensible, evidence-informed thing to do where that doubt exists is to kind of lean into what seems to possibly be the case, or what seems to most likely be the case, which is comprehension strategies, at the very least, do no harm. And it seems to be the case that if we do them this way, it works. I'm just suggesting that maybe there are components of this way that, that we can strip out. But until we know, teach comprehension strategies, absolutely. Kids are struggling to comprehend, even though they're relatively fluent. Do a comprehension strategy intervention. Embed comprehension strategies into your teaching of reading. I mean, even if the research suggests otherwise, that that actually summarizing or visualizing or self-questioning isn't as valuable as just finding ways to get kids to actively engage with text. Let's do those things anyway. Getting kids to ask questions of a text they're reading is a really great way to get them to understand a text. Asking them to summarize a text is a great way to get them to understand the text. The focus here, though, is using these things for this important ultimate goal of understanding the valuable text that's in front of them, rather than, oh, this is like a strategy that I want you to use from now on when you struggle with text.
The only thing I'd say there is, before we go to, if their fluency is fine, before we go to comprehension, let's just check vocabulary, because I reckon 9 times out of 10 it's probably I think in the terms of, like, if I was to do a little one of Chris's now infamous flow charts on everything for reading intervention, it'd be, do they know enough of the code? Yes, no, go this way. Can they read the code fluently? Yes, no, go that way. And that'll be like, do they have a decent understanding of general vocabulary, tier 2-ish vocabulary? And then I'd go to some sort of comprehension intervention.
I guess the question there is, if you suspect the vocabulary is an issue, what do you do about it? Because again, there's decent evidence to suggest, we can put a vocabulary intervention into place. But if you pick apart that research, you find that it's like, brilliant, they learned 20 words in 35 hours. It's not quite that bad, but it's not far off. And kids are learning 8 to 12-ish words per day just from their interactions. So the idea of using that much intervention time, it's like, how do you know they're not just going to learn that many words like in the classroom anyway? I mean, I know the research suggests that, maybe they do, but all of the ways that you measure the impact of vocabulary research, apart from with the youngest children, tend to be, have they learned the words that are on this list that we wanted to teach them? So you're not really comparing like with like. For me, if a kid's struggling with vocabulary, outside of the very youngest children, where I might put in place a kind of quite intense spoken language intervention, particularly say in reception or key stage 1, just giving them lots and lots of time to talk and express themselves and to have that kind of adult time. Beyond that, if a kid's short of vocabulary, I want that to be happening in the rest of my lessons. I want that I think they're best off learning that from the history and the geography and the science, etc., that they do. So one of the reasons why I might not include that in one of my flow diagrams is because there isn't a circumstance where that changes my decision making massively.
Maybe like of that specific text, maybe you want to be like, okay, do you know the words in the specific text? That might then give you a further clue to stop putting them. But it's either vocabulary. It's either a vocabulary issue, which, as you say, will get dealt with through various means. And they say it's really tricky to, you can't teach every word in an intervention. That's just silly. But you can at least keep them in the history lessons by not then taking them out for a comprehension strategy intervention if they don't need it, and that's actually more of a let's say just a general, the vocabulary in this particular text was not kind to you because you had no idea what a bewildering warthog was in this particular instance.
The only other element of that is just how difficult it is to do kind of vocabulary style assessments, just because, again, the domain is so massive that, but yeah, I get where you're coming from. If you're a teacher and you think, you know what, they do pay attention to text, but the issue I'm finding on a day-to-day basis is they're not understanding the words that are in that, or enough of the words that are in that text. Quite basic stuff, they're in year 6 and I was shocked that they didn't know what the word picnic meant, for example. Then that might indicate to you that actually, it's a breadth and depth of vocabulary issue related specifically to the kinds of stuff we learn in school. So that's something to always bear in mind, because quite often we say, oh, this kid's got issues with vocabulary. And what we mean is this kid doesn't have the particular vocabulary related to the things that we want to teach them and the kind of texts that we use in school. Beyond kind of academic stuff, it might not be the case.
Indeed.
There's been lots wrapped up inside these sort of slightly bigger ideas, but I haven't heard anyone mention 2 things yet. One was metacognition, and one was motivation. Do you think those 2 would round off the conversation before we make a decision about what 5 things our teachers need to know?
I would say that very briefly, it would be before we dive into those. I think it's to me at least, there's kind of perhaps not as much to say about those, except with regards to metacognition, to say that a lot of what we've been talking about so far about comprehension strategies is directly related to metacognition, because there's this idea, the way that it's stated in the research and is kind of standard or standards of coherence, which is the level of that a reader sets for themselves in terms of how well they need to understand this text. And it depends on what you're reading. If you're reading a job description, you might want to know every word, and you're going back and you're checking. If you're reading a romance novel late at night before bed, you might be happy it might be fine if you don't understand the odd bits and pieces here or there, the odd paragraph. But you set a standard of coherence, and one of the things about metacognition is recognizing, based on that standard of coherence, whether your comprehension is where you want it to be, and then reacting. And a big part of, at least the theory behind comprehension strategies, is that it's tuning kids into that idea, into that process, into them taking charge, as it were, as I mentioned earlier, of their comprehension, and recognizing when the standard of coherence that they've set for a text hasn't been met, and then rereading or knowing that, I found that tricky, I'm going to summarize that in my head before I move on, that kind of stuff. So I think we have talked a bit about metacognition. The thing I would kind of very briefly, that'll be a challenge, but I'll try not to spend too long talking about is, well, what are the bodies of knowledge? What are the interconnected bodies of knowledge that kids need to develop in order to be able to comprehend? What is it that people know about, that allows them to, when they're reading a text, to build the situation model of it that Neil described? And just for those who are kind of new to this idea, situation model is kind of a mental representation of the meaning of a text. We don't remember our own little version of the text. What we remember is a version of the meaning that we made of that text. It's our own, the gist of it, in effect. So what are the bodies of knowledge that allows us to do that? Well, knowledge of words, knowledge of texts, and knowledge of the world that those two things describe is the short version of that. We've talked about vocabulary, breadth and depth, but obviously vocabulary doesn't exist, in isolation. Words exist in concert with one another. And so how words interact. So we're talking about sentence structure, for example. That's an important piece of the puzzle in terms of what we need to know. And obviously we need to understand the wider world, but again, that taps into vocabulary. It's impossible to separate what we know about the world from the words that we use to describe it. But there's also other bits and pieces, like knowledge of text structure. Neil mentioned subheadings earlier. Knowing what a subheading does, very helpful for understanding a text. Knowing what a paragraph does or the many things that a paragraph can do, really useful for understanding texts. So understanding how texts are put together is really useful as well. In short, kind of vocabulary, worldly knowledge, which is sometimes described as background knowledge when we're talking about a specific text, knowledge of text structure and knowledge of sentence structure. Those are all really kind of useful things. And then alongside that, potentially this knowledge and skills related to metacognition that relates to this comprehension strategy stuff that we've mentioned before. But those that little group of things there, if you know that stuff related to a text and you can decode it relatively fluently, you're in a pretty good place.
Yeah, I think one of the main, one of the main highlights from the text, from what you're reading for that you gave today, Chris, was that effectively the greater the background knowledge of the text, basically the greater the standard of coherence that people generally have when it comes to understanding particular texts and things like that. So, and I agree with Chris on what he said. We need to understand all of those things, and those things can seem, there's like a real kind of minutiae that you can kind of like go in. Understanding sentences. You can think about that as understanding different word classes. Like one that comes to my mind is particularly is like pronouns, understanding how like a pronoun might relate to a previous noun. Particularly if there's been a string of nouns, you need to understand how what the word them might be referring to, back to, some previous nouns. All of that kind of stuff has, implications for, that situational model, that standard of coherence that, we build upon, understanding. Chris mentioned, picnic. If I said, oh, Chris and I spent a lovely day in Peterborough, had a lovely picnic, and I took brought out 2 lagers. There's that understanding that these 2 lagers didn't just appear from thin air. That's kind of like almost like item and container kind of relationship between the idea that this idea of this picnic was the container, and these 2 lagers are 2 items that have come from that, and all these kind of linguistic relationships that words have, that I think we just kind of take for granted, that children. And I think when we go back to different word, different kind of like question types, those are the things that those question types very rarely actually discuss at all, because they're not really in part of those things, kind of really understanding all the this kind of linguistic connection, these linguistic connections kind of between these on this kind of small word, phrase, sentence level.
Just a couple of things, if I may, like kind of build on that a touch. I mentioned before, text structure, sentence structure, vocabulary, worldly knowledge, and it's tempting and useful to look at these things, in separate baskets, but actually there's loads of overlap between them, and separating them. It isn't just vocabulary and worldly knowledge that are difficult to separate. It goes beyond that. Neil mentioned anaphoric references, the idea of these words that refer back to something that's come before, like pronouns. So as you say, we got out the 2 beers and sat and drank them. Well, them is an anaphoric reference back to this idea of the 2 beers. And the question is then, okay, so this word them, me understanding that often will refer back to something that comes before. Well, is that my understanding of of that word in terms of its vocabulary depth, or is that my understanding of the way that sentences are structured? Well, it's both, I guess. And so, even vocabulary and sentence structure aren't, things that we can completely pick apart. Really, I talk about knowledge of words, text, and the wider world. And in some ways, that's an artificial division as well. What we're really talking about in terms of this, and I love this phrase, I apologize for using it so many times, these interconnected bodies of knowledge, what we're really talking about is, what do you understand about our language in its written form and how it connects to its spoken form? That's what you've got to kind of grasp, and what we have to teach if we're going to support pupils to be better at comprehending the texts that we choose to put in front of them.
With regards to the motivational aspect, Kieran, obviously you just want to make sure, say, the way to build, this interconnected bodies of knowledge, as Chris said, is that eventually students do get to the point where they start learning to read, and they begin, reading to learn. So there needs to be, schools can only do so much. There needs to be that motivational aspect. That means that effectively for me, that reading, that children see reading as a viable option instead of going on social media, instead of playing PlayStation, whatever else that they decide to do with their time. And so I just think whatever you can do to make reading available to pupils is going to help motivate them, because it's easy for them to access. As a teacher, talk about books that you're reading and bring about this idea that you are a little reading community, if that's what you want to do. We can talk about then the research on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Like, do we want to reward those that read with stickers and things like that? I think at primary, a little bit of extrinsic motivation doesn't hurt that much, as long as you're not always kind of relying on it to be so, and there is some idea to fade it out. And again, I think this idea certainly used to be, this idea that teachers, and I'm not talking about decodable texts here, that teachers would have some sort of say, the amount of teachers I've seen or I've heard was like, oh no, you can't read that one, mate. So that one's not for you. That's going to kill any motivation to read, dead in the water if all you have to do is, the old kind of book bans idea, and there's, some idea of, instructional level stuff that, accelerated reader has said you can only read books between this point and this point. How dare you choose something that might interest you?
You've been trying to throw the cat amongst the pigeons a few times, Kieran, and so I'm going to intentionally pick up on something Neil said there and say that I don't like it, and that's hard to do because we agree on so much. The dichotomy of learning to read and reading to learn, and this is harsh because I know that you probably already think this, but I'm saying anyway, I really dislike that dichotomy just because I just don't think it really exists. Like, I think that even as an adult, reading a challenging book, picking up new vocabulary, becoming more comfortable with particular kind of ways of structuring texts, I think we're always learning to read. And so on some level, I don't think it's just, we've learned to read and now we're reading to learn. Not a fan of that dichotomy. I understand why it's popular, just not a fan. On the other hand, what I do love that Neil said is this, talking about motivation. And what I'd like, just maybe a final thing to say on the kind of topic of reading comprehension, at least on my part, is that I think we can maybe tie together these ideas of like interconnected bodies of knowledge and developing people's understanding of them with motivation by thinking about the texts that we choose to put in front of pupils, not in terms of their independent reading necessarily, but in terms of the reading that we ask of them in a classroom situation. It's very tempting to just, find extracts and get kids to ask questions. And sometimes it's easier to plan that way. And sometimes it can feel like you're, doing something towards SATs outcomes. And 99 times out of 100, that isn't the case. I would say genuinely the texts that we choose for pupils to learn from in our classroom are as important as the way that we choose to teach them. Because in the end, if we're saying that this content, this understanding of the language, of the concepts and the objects in the wider world that this language relates to, that knowing this stuff is essential to pupils' understanding of what they read, then it really matters what we put in front of kids. It matters if they are not learning about certain things or not seeing certain kinds of language or seeing certain kinds of plot structures, etc., in the books that we put in front of children. So if there's like one final message that I think both relates to this idea of motivation, because I do think that we can motivate pupils through the choices of texts that we have in our school curriculum, and kind of connects to this idea of teaching pupils these interconnected bodies of knowledge, than it is text choice and the primacy of it in primary education.
So we've got to filter all this down to 5 things. I'm going to throw a grenade in at those cats and pigeons while you guys think about your 5. Someone shared a picture of an old school SATs reading paper in reference to what post-2016 looked like. Do you think that represents a rise in standards? Or is it a poor proxy and it's actually testing things that we wouldn't necessarily associate with reading capacity?
I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong about this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think, unless I'm mistaken, having seen the tweet in question, that was one of the rare occasions where multiple choice questions, which is the easiest of all of the kinds of questions that children face, were also the first set of questions that children faced in the entire paper. So I think that gives and it might be, if that's questions that come later on, then I'm wrong about that. But if I'm right about that, then I think that gives it looks easy because it's the easiest possible beginning. I'd want to see the questions that existed at the end of that paper before I rushed to any particular judgments about the kind of rise in standards generally. I think where we do see a rise in standards, though, is the actual, like the booklet itself, the actual reading content, the length of it in particular. It's been getting longer and longer, these texts. But I don't necessarily think that is a particularly good example of the test getting more difficult.
That's worth 7 marks. Like, I've not seen, like, even when just thinking about multiple choice questions that children face now, I don't even think even across the 3 texts that, 7 marks are available just on the multiple choice questions. So I guess, from there you could argue that perhaps, this raising standards by, having fewer marks available for those questions. I certainly think there's less hints as to where they are. So usually it might say, look at page 9, what does so-and-so think? Again, we're recording this on the day of the 2023 reading sats. Obviously, we can't give too much detail away, but...
Not for free anyway.
Not for free.
I mean, I'll just clarify that I obviously have no access to these papers, so...
Yeah, I don't either. So is there not much on the way of multiple choice this year?
No, that's what a lot of the hoo-ha is about, is the lack of...
fair enough then. I mean, cut what I said then, because I don't have access to this year's either. But there's usually some multiple choice, and it's usually worth a few marks. If they've cut the multiple choice this year, then please cut what I said. It makes no sense whatsoever.
They haven't cut it completely, but there's certainly there's definitely less than 7 across the 3 texts when in that one.
Oh, fair enough then. I mean, that's probably
available there.
If this then is an indirect, if this is a specific reference to this year's paper that existed today and that I don't know about, then yet I will.
It might well be.
Then fair enough. Yeah. Yes. Please cut what I said there.
Or don't.
Or don't. Yeah. Just fucking throw me to the wolves.
I mean, from my perspective, it seems like is cognitive demand the sort of attribute we'd assign to the difficulty of questions. So, for instance, a multiple choice question has a low cognitive demand.
Yeah.
Some sort of question that depends on inference and a lot of prior background knowledge might be something with a high cognitive demand. It feels like that's more difficult, which is why I'm not sure. There's a greater cognitive demand in terms of accessing the paper than there used to be, and you could game the old papers quite easily. You could send pupils to certain points and say, this is what you got to do to get this bit. This is what you got to do to get this bit. And you could probably go through and do all the retrieval questions and be very close to a level 3, level 4. It doesn't feel like you can do that anymore. Although, to be fair, all I've really done in the last 4 or 5 is just to visualize the reading paper as opposed to have any input into the instruction. So I don't know the answer, but that's what it feels like. And I thought that picture was quite a good example of it.
Yeah. I'd definitely say the cognitive demand of the questions has gone up, and they were definitely not as kind in terms of pinpointing where one might find the answer to these questions. So the range was quite large, whereas usually it might say, look at this line or look at this particular paragraph, find the answer to whatever question it is. Now it was far more broad of either, look from the paragraph starting X to the paragraph that ends Y. And, the answer to the question itself, that might be 2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs of text. Whereas, it does feel like in the old, certainly not in the old SATs, but in previous SATs, they would have narrowed that window to where you found the answer, which of course then it relies on children, being able to, skim quite a fair bit. And again, going back to, these construction integration model, have they been able to do a decent enough of those ones on that kind of first read to make sure they have a gist, as Chris said, about, roughly where that might be in that paper, so they can just quickly skim to find what they need, et cetera, et cetera. I personally found the text, acceptable. I didn't think the texts were the hardest texts that we've had as a collection. But again, I think the cognitive demand of the questions, as well as the support there to find the answers, did increase.
Yeah, and there's a couple of points here as well, isn't there? Which is that in the end, the difficulty of this kind of stuff is primarily dictated by the difficulty of the text. I mean, you can give me you can give these kids a load of multiple choice questions, but if the text in front of them is crime and punishment, then they're probably not going to get that far. In the end, it's worth noting, I think, that the difficulty of any reading paper is primarily, not solely, but primarily dictated by the difficulty of the text. And that's not just, as we mentioned earlier, the length of the text, it's the complexity of the sentence structures, it's the vocabulary, it's all the things that we've discussed, in fact. And the second thing, I guess, to note is that presumably the boundaries for pass, as it were, or for different the different number scores that the different standardized number scores that kids are going to get will be shifted around based on how kids do. So this idea of it was a difficult paper, it was an easy paper, doesn't really mean anything in the end, does it? Hugely, unless I don't think they decide in advance where the grade boundaries are going to be. Or if they do, then they do so in relation to some kind of pre-testing kind of metric. I know that's what they did back in the day. But even so, in short, a difficult test is going to have a different kind of, for want of a better phrase, grade boundaries than an easier one. So it doesn't, make a hill of beans difference, apart from, I guess, how pupils feel about the test as they do it, which is obviously something that's worth bearing in mind.
Okay, so I mean, that was an interesting diversion. I don't think we actually landed on anything concrete, but I can, I don't. Maybe there isn't the existence of a definite answer, and all these things are very highly politically subjective. But if we had to summarize the 5 things that every teacher needs to know about reading comprehension, what do you think those 5 things are?
Reel them off, Chris.
Hard to summarize fairly wide-ranging discussion, but thankfully I've got some notes in front of me from what we talked about. So first, when thinking about comprehension, it is something that is particularly challenging to do, if not close to impossible to do, without a certain level of reading fluency. So we need to think, and we need to make sure that pupils are relatively fluent as part of their reading curriculum in order to support comprehension, while remembering that there is this reciprocal relationship between comprehension and fluency, and they support each other. I guess the second thing is that it isn't really effective to attempt to teach reading comprehension via the teaching of particular question types. Getting kids to be able to answer particular kinds of questions is not a very efficient way to support their comprehension development. And why is that? Well, because it doesn't really seem to make sense to think of comprehension as this skill-based construct where something that you learn automatically transfers to a completely different text. The third thing is that comprehension depends upon our knowledge of language, both the written language and the spoken language upon which it relies. And so that means we're supporting pupils' development of words, texts, and their knowledge of the wider world. I guess the fourth thing is we need to think about the teaching of comprehension strategies, either or both through interventions and embedded into classroom instruction. Now, the key thing about these comprehension strategies is they support pupils' kind of metacognition for reading. They are ways that we can awaken pupils to how active they need to be, to the kind of detective work that we want them to do as they read. And I guess the final thing is that when it comes to a reading curriculum and the development of comprehension, the texts that you choose to teach to children and read with children are as important as how we teach them, not just for the development of these interconnected bodies of knowledge I mentioned, but also for the development of pupils' motivation as independent readers.
Fantastic. So hopefully that summary will help. I mean, it certainly helped me clarify my thoughts because we covered quite a lot in this episode. Obviously, both Neil and Chris, you have spoken about reading in various ways on thinking deeply about primary education, whether that be through individual episodes or Neil on the YouTube, you delivered some CPD about reading quite a while ago now. So if anyone, this is the first time you're coming to this, definitely go back and check it out. And I think on Spotify, I've got a playlist with the title Reading. So if you search on Spotify for Tadape Reading, you'll get everything that has the sort of label of reading against it. So yeah, it might be worth checking out. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.
Yeah, so when I'm reading Dostoevsky,
My cultural literacy is superior to yours.
I've not actually read any of his work in years.